My name is Brianna, as Nadia just explained, and the working title of my project has actually evolved since the printing of this bulletin. So the working title of my project now is Dissecting the Frame, a nuanced interpretation of photo voice engagement. These 10 minutes are going to fly by, so I'm just going to jump right in. Essentially, I'm going to give you an overview of what I did this summer. I'm going to tell you what I learned from the experience, and then I'm going to tell you where I see the research going. Similar to Laurel, this is going to be a year-long engagement, probably beyond for me. So I want to back up just a quick second to give you an idea of how I arrived at this project in the first place. Before coming to Stanford, I trained and worked as a photographer in a variety of different contexts. My real passion is with documentary photography. Telling a story through images, sorry, I'm cleansing my nerves. Telling a story with images with the intention to spread awareness of social injustices and to have some sort of positive impact through my photographs. A variety of reasons led me to return to school and come here to study anthropology here at Stanford with a continued commitment to develop a service-oriented career. And in this process, I came across community-based participatory research in which the traditional research subjects that we study on actually become invited to participate in the research process. For a while, I struggled to see how I could bring photography into this dialogue and how it might fit with my new academic interests, especially in light of ongoing critique within anthropology around representation, service work, and humanitarianism. But I was determined to find a way to combine photography, service, and anthropology in a way that they could work together and not work against each other. I really struggled to reconcile the three until I finally came across this methodology of photo voice. I still struggle, let's be honest. But I found something that I could finally move forward with in which I could engage all three of these elements in dialogue. And photo voice essentially became the basis of my community research summer internship. So what is photo voice? I know that it's not very commonly known. And neither is community-based participatory research, I think, for that matter. I assume if you're in this forum, you have some sense of community-based research. But let me tell you what photo voice is. It's a participatory photography methodology. So the participatory nature is that the participants of the research engage in photography as the method for conducting the research. And it finds its roots in community-based participatory research. The method was actually developed in 1992 by Dr. Carolyn Wang and Dr. Marianne Burris, who were inspired by notions of empowerment and feminist theory, and Paulo Freire's concepts of critical pedagogy. So in most cases, this methodology is used to give voice to individuals who are otherwise silenced within mainstream networks of communication due to barriers of language, literacy, or social status. So how does it work? What does it look like? Essentially, the research participants are given access to cameras to document a particular theme or social issue that is directly related to their community. Then they hold focus groups to discuss the progression of their photography and later view and critique their photographs as a way of progressing this dialogue. In the collective dialogue, themes and patterns emerge throughout the images and are further developed in conversation with community members. And through this process, community members find strength and solidarity and begin ways to see how they can articulate their collective voice in efforts of social justice. So the goal of that self-empowerment derived from the process of photo voice is aimed at inspiring a confidence to mobilize and communicate with relevant stakeholders and policymakers to enact positive social change. So in a nutshell, photo voice is basically an investigatory method in which people learn to share what they care about, to explain why they care about it, and what they really have to say about what they want it to do. So now I'm going to tell you what I did in terms of photo voice and what I did for this summer internship. This past summer, I was given the opportunity to facilitate a photo voice project at the Full Circle Farm in Sunnyvale. Here's a few. These are actually my own pictures, and I'll explain why a little bit later. There's some pictures up here about the experience. The project was essentially led by Dr. Christopher Gardner and a team of Stanford students in human biology and earth systems. In the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to go into the larger project, but I want to share with you how my photo voice component kind of worked alongside with this farm-based education camp for 5 to 14-year-old children. The farm benefited from this project with Stanford in that each of us researchers took on the role as a camp counselor at no cost to our community partner, thanks to this department and other departmental funding sources. So with the photo voice component, I really wanted to learn the nuance behind participant engagement in order to inform a culturally specific application of the methodology. I had a bunch of questions in my head. I was looking at what factors allow for effective participation with this with photo voice. And I wanted to look at if there are patterns or distinctions among or between ethnic groups that influence this engagement. I also really ultimately was interested in whether or not we can tailor the methodology to enhance participation, whether different tweaks we can make to enacting the method so that it's more effective where it needs to be. So essentially I set out to explore whether or not one's ethnic or cultural identity influence the extent to which one engages with photo voice as a tool for expression and sharing. In this process, I incorporated a variety of methods as part of the larger photo voice methodology. At the beginning of each new week, I circulated parent surveys to get a sense of the campers' cultural backgrounds and any previous exposure to photography. After introducing the campers to the project, they were given basic photo skills training. Very basic photo skills training. If you look closely, there's actually vegetables wrapped around the camera, which was a nice touch. They were given disposable cameras, so it was more about not taking pictures in a dark hole or at the sunlight, and how to use the flash. And then each day I kept an exposure tally to kind of track the rate at which the students were taking the pictures and see how quickly, how slowly, how methodically this is happening. I also observed the children from the dual perspective of a camp counselor and as a researcher, and this largely helped to inform the larger piece of my research. One of the fundamental elements of photo voice as a methodological unit, aside from this exposure tally and photo skills training, are the focus groups. That's really kind of at the core, that's the voice component of photo voice. And so for my project, each of the 6 weeks, I conducted 2 different focus groups with each group of children. On Wednesday of each week, before they had their prints in hand, I facilitated a focus group on the process of photography, in which the campers shared their thoughts on photographing as an experience, as an interaction with vision and voice. Each Friday I distributed the campers' prints, which was a very exciting event, and they chose a few photographs to share with the group. This focus group centered on the product of photography and the tangible element and what that product could do for them in expressing themselves. So they were asked to tell the group why they chose to share each image and why it was important to them. Now I'm going to tell you a few things that I learned in the process of conducting this project. In terms of general research and field work, I learned a very important lesson, that no amount of preparation or planning will ever ensure a 100% success rate. I learned to be flexible and patient with factors that are ultimately out of my control, and to forgive myself for things that didn't work out just exactly how I wanted them to. And this is kind of piggybacking on my experience of trying to develop photos during the week of 4th of July, which was a challenge, ultimately a failure, but excuse me. In terms of the collaborative nature of the research, I learned that juggling multiple goals and priorities makes the process of community-based participatory research very complex and challenging, in a very real way. I heard about this, but it was interesting to experience it. And through those challenges, I am actually very grateful to have had the opportunity to clarify what my goals with the research really were, and to clearly define an ethical standard that I felt comfortable with moving forward with the research. In terms of photo voice, and in terms of my research question, I learned that I really, really love the methodology. I learned that I'm excited to work with it in different contexts and in the future. It actually does something, and that something is what I'm going to figure out this year, but there's substance to it, and there's a lot to be gained from it, and I'm really excited to explore that. With regard to my specific question about the influence of one's racial and ethnic identity on participant engagement, I'm initially led to think that perhaps this angle is not as straightforward as I had thought going in. We had a number of sibling pairs throughout the 6 weeks of camp, and I noticed very different and divergent ways in which these sibling pairs interacted and behaved with photo voice. And in that sense, I'm led away just because of the assumption that they come from a very similar ethnic background and a very similar home environment, and so I was kind of led in a different direction. So now I'm following the data and going that way. I'd like to share with you a couple of thoughtful observations that one camper made during our focus group sessions, which have heavily influenced this redirection of my analysis. So I asked the children in this session why they think people take pictures. And one camper responded very, very deliberately. She said, "So many people have a good memory, but not for long. Like, if you did something when you were 4 years old and you forget, it's okay. But a camera helps you remember, and you can remember it for your whole life." So I thought that was interesting. There was a lot of conversation about memory and the use of photos. The same camper responded later when I asked if anybody enjoyed looking at pretty pictures without knowing the photographer, without having the memory themselves. And she said, "You can be touched by other people's memories. Some are really pretty, and some may be sad, but it can turn into thoughtfulness." I was really intrigued by this deeper emotional and conceptual engagement that this child, she was 8 years old. I was like, okay, that's a wrap. No, but I was really intrigued by how these children connect photographs to emotions, and that's kind of the direction that I want to explore. Which brings me to the next and final part of my presentation, which is where I'm headed with the research. The basis for my initial guiding question was to understand nuances in participation with photo voice in order to improve upon the efficacy and validity of future application. So although my frame may shift a little, the underlying goal remains the same. I want to see how we can make this methodology better. Logistically, the next step for me with this project are to continue data analysis. I have a few more focus groups to transcribe, some qualitative coding. I also like to understand more clearly some of the quantitative information that I collected and have it kind of as a statistical backdrop as a reference as I move forward. And most importantly, I'm looking forward to doing more document analysis with the campers' photographs themselves, which is why I didn't bring theirs, because I was very anxious about removing them from their organized packets right now and getting them mixed up. So as I begin to write my master's thesis on this project, I'll continue to explore the ethics and politics of representation, which is kind of what initially brought me into this project, and the communication through images, with the ultimate goal to understand how this data can be used to inform a more tailored application of photo voice methodology in order to enhance participant engagement and ultimately strengthen efforts of community-driven social change. Thank you. Are there any questions?
So in terms of any differences between different racial and ethnic groups that you worked with, you didn't find any significant differences. This is just what you think. Do you think that might be an answer for photo voice in general, that maybe we don't need to develop ethnic specific ways to use it? Or do you think that it might just be applicable to kids who are growing up in the US, and even though they might have ethnic backgrounds who are different, they are more common to each other than maybe who are working with adults?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I was reflecting on, and something that I even thought before I went into the project was how representative are these ethnic backgrounds going to be if I were to take this methodology into Mexico, into Korea, into India, into anywhere. And I think that might be, one element of why there's not this stark contrast or a blatantly significant difference at this point. I am keeping that, as one of my, lenses, yeah. One of my lenses as I move through looking at the data, and obviously I have a lot. I have a lot to go through still, so it might come out, but I agree, I believe that is a huge element. Yes.
So my sense is that kids, and especially older kids, might have more exposure to taking pictures through like iPhones or camera phones. Did you talk about that with them, and how do you see photo voice as different, like giving them a set time?
Yeah. So one thing that was really crucial in the skills training workshop was to explain how this camera, it stops at a certain point. You can't just keep taking pictures because there is, there's a huge exposure to digital photography in phones and various other technology devices. So we did talk about that, and it was an interesting thing to wrestle with the 5-year-old group. The 11 to 14, we had 6 weeks of camp, and every 2 weeks was a different age group as we moved from 5 to 14-year-olds. The older age group recognized the limitation a little bit more, but there were definitely some 5-year-olds who got it too. And as far as the difference between photo voice and everyday photography, I think that was one of the main reasons that I really wanted to use film cameras, because I felt like having a different mechanism to work with would change the relationship with photography. Having everyone bring their digital cameras and sharing them in the instant that they took the pictures, and being able to retake the picture just as easily if you didn't like it or if the sun was glaring or things like that. I wanted it to be a more deliberate experience for them, and I think that having the different apparatus was a real key component to that. So I think it did shift their approach in that way.
I have a question. You mentioned at the beginning about community-based research, and this is sort of participatory methodology, and I'm just thinking, one purpose of community-based research and participatory methodology is that it's part of a larger effort of empowerment or of community change processes or transformation. And so you're looking at this as a method. I'm wondering, in your project, particularly as you develop it further, you've sort of, in this program, taking students aside, sort of worked on the methodology, but is there and can there be a connection to a larger transformation process that goes beyond one individual realizing they have a voice to some level of community moving forward together? And that photo voice is sort of one way of getting that process going. So I'm having a hard time seeing where your project can connect back to community, because it seems like taking these students out of context, did an experiment with them, and now you're kind of just working with that methodology. So how do you connect this back to the community, and have you thought that through?
Well, with your help and the Public Service Scholars Program, I'm going to tease out a more tangible service application that comes out of this project. But as far as what you're saying, I agree, and that was kind of went along with the limitations of context for me and the opportunity of where and when I could facilitate this methodology. In the future, I'd like to translate it into more sensitive topics and more sensitive communities, in the sense of having a real push to make a change with something. And it was difficult with the transition from week to week of different children to do as is recommended and suggested within community-based research, to start at the beginning and say how are we framing this project, where do we want to go with this, and decide collectively. That was not possible for me. Also, the fact that the 120 so campers were never all together at the same time. So I tried to think about how it could come full circle, and I did have a few ideas of, a photo recipe book or something like that to come out of the camp. And funding, not here, but just funding in general, is difficult to kind of wrap your hands on. And so that's something that is a project I'd like to pursue, but I don't know how. It's hard with this particular situation for me to see how I could have brought the whole group together as a way of coming full circle with that. But that's why I want to understand the methodology more, and that was my purpose for this.
I mean, I understand the question, but I think that this is a very necessary first step, just to give kids a sense that they have the capacity to record something that's meaningful. We did this project at International Hotel during the eviction, and the major news media were absent. I mean, they just didn't care unless a politician was involved. But there were copious, reel-to-reel audio recordings done by the activists themselves, and the archive is full now because people thought this might be useful sometime in the future. And you can imagine these kids, just have their cell phones, now all of a sudden feel like they can be part of a collaboration that right now we can't imagine. But I think this is a very interesting sort of first step to sensitize people to the possibility of doing something that's not purely individualistic. It might link up, but we don't know that, the formation yet.
Yeah, exactly. And I did actually, I did see somewhat of a parallel with this particular population. I'm wrapping up, I promise. This particular population as children, as being somewhat of a marginalized population as far as not always having the ability or the validation of their voice. And so I felt like the process of encouraging them to explore things themselves and then to express it and communicate it was and could be compared later on to other populations who struggle due to language barriers or due to social status and things like that, where you see this kind of self-empowerment transformation happening, and this idea that, yeah, now I can actually go do this, and this is how we can do it together.
Great.